You're watching LaRouchePAC's weekly Saturday night class series. My name's Tony Papert. I'm hosting this class, but the presentation is by Bob Ingraham. And the title is Benjamin Franklin, the American Prometheus. Tonight's the second class in a series on the concept of Prometheus. And the first one was last week, and I'd encourage people to watch it. I'm bringing it up now. You can find it on our website, LaRouchePAC.com, and you see it here. The title, A Promethean Vision for the Future, with Dan Leach. And I recommend that, but just briefly, I mean, this is an ancient story of a mythical hero who was a titan, a sort of god. And the story told by the Greek tragedian Aeschylus, but the story existed long before Greece, was that the evil king of the gods, the evil tyrant of the pagan gods, Zeus, had decided to make the human race extinct and replace it with something else. The only one who moved to defend mankind was the Titan Prometheus, out of his love for mankind. And what he did to preserve us from Zeus's extinction was to give us the gift of fire, fire which was known and used by the gods, but not by man. And fire, with using fire as the basis for every art, which indeed it was, agriculture, pottery, metallurgy, chemistry, of course, just keeping warm through the winter, mankind was able to survive and flourish and defy, with Prometheus' help, the will of the pagan deity Zeus, which would have sentenced us to extinction. But in punishment by Zeus for this act, Prometheus was chained to a mountain and tortured for millennia by an eagle, which came and ate out his liver. The liver, being that he was an immortal, the liver would grow back, and then for the eagle to return and eat out his liver again. So Prometheus was chained to the rock in torture for the act of saving mankind through the gift of fire. And if you read the play or join us for last week's class, you see that fire here is even much broader than the significance of being the basis of all mankind's arts and sciences, that the fire itself is the fire of the creative human intellect. So, and that's a brief and I'm sure easy to misunderstand recap of a very long story, which you can get a better grasp of in last week's class, and I think in this week's class to come. But this has been a powerful theme throughout all history. Indeed, it confronts us today in a new form. So with that, let me bring on Bob Ingraham.
Excuse me. Hello, everyone. So yes, with that introduction, what we're going to be talking about tonight is Benjamin Franklin, who is often called the American Prometheus. And, there's this famous painting by, I think, Benjamin West depicting Franklin with, I think, lightning or what have you. It was the French economist and statesman Turgot, who said of Franklin he snatched lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants. So Benjamin Franklin is the subject, but this is, I want to make it clear from the beginning that, what is presented here is not a discussion of American history, nor is it we're going to be talking about Franklin's scientific experiments, his work in electricity, but nor is it narrowly about science or technology. That what we're talking about is the role of the individual human being, or in the case of our nation, the individual citizen of our republic in history. The question here is to what we're involved in. If you look at all the turmoil that surrounds us right now, this political battle, that political battle, but you have to step back from these individual battles, and ask yourself the question of what is it we're fighting for? Because what we're doing is we're fighting for a better future. A future for our republic, a future for our children and grandchildren and generations to come, a future more peaceful, more prosperous, with more opportunity. This battle, this fight we're in, is it involves a great deal of responsibility on the individual citizen of our nation. And when you look at Franklin and you look at his entire career, one of the main things that he never lost sight of was his fight to get people to think and to act on a higher level. In a certain sense, to stop being underlings. To stop, to find within themselves the qualities necessary to lead the nation into the future. And I mean, this is the problem that, people run up against again and again and again. They say, well, I'm just a little person, a little me. I don't really have a lot of expertise in this, that, or the other thing. I don't have any political experience. So you get people, sort of waiting for a savior, a man on the white horse who is going to come and save them. And obviously in the case of Donald Trump, we have a unique historical leader who we have to get back into the White House. But to put all of the responsibility for saving our nation, for getting out of this crisis, to put all of that responsibility on the shoulders of Donald Trump is ridiculous. It's up to each and every one of us. And that requires, and that's why this question of Prometheus is really so central. It's not just, Tony went through it, and we had Dan's class last week, which hopefully everyone has seen. But, we're not talking about, a Greek myth. What we're talking about is the question of what does it mean to be human? This is hopefully what we're going to get into tonight. Now this is going to be broken down into two sections. The first section is going to be on, Franklin's work in science. And the second section is going to deal more with his deeper philosophical and moral convictions. What I'm not going to be talking about tonight, and maybe this might be the subject of a future discussion, but what I'm not going to be talking about is Franklin's political battles, particularly his decades-long battle with the European with the British oligarchy, his battle against the British Empire. Um, that is we're going to put that to one side in terms of tonight. Now, I'll begin by saying that when a lot of people, particularly people who are Trump supporters, but a lot of people in general, when they think about the United States, one of the first things that comes to mind is the question of liberty, the question of freedom, that America is a nation founded on the principle of, personal liberty, of human freedom. But, that's fine. That's true. But you have to ask yourself, what is your concept of freedom? Is it freedom to do anything you want? Is it freedom to act like an animal? Is it freedom to be an anarchist? Is it freedom if you happen to be one of these rich oligarchs to speculate in the financial markets, to move all of our jobs overseas? Don't you have the freedom? Don't you have the constitutional liberty to move all of our factories overseas? Don't you have the freedom to wallow in Hollywood culture and to be as degenerate as you can possibly imagine? I mean, a lot of people would answer yes to that today. But the one way look, what we have to really think through here in terms of this discussion of Franklin is the question of Prometheus, but also what that involves is a higher concept of the notion of freedom as it was understood by our founding fathers. Freedom to create, freedom to build, freedom to increase mankind's power over nature, freedom to create a society, to better society for the common good, to create a better future than what we have now. This is what was not allowed under empire. These were not things that the individual citizen had any say-so over. But in our republic, we do, and it is the power to create, the power to build, the power to develop society in a positive direction for the good of all. And that very much is central to this question of Franklin, because you have to ask yourself, what is it that Franklin was fighting for? What were our founding fathers fighting for? What was their notion of the type of society, the type of culture free of oligarchy that they desired to create, in the 13 colonies? So I'm just going to jump right into this question of Franklin and science, because history books, and even in his own lifetime, the British scientific establishment, intellectual establishment, denigrated Franklin, and it still exists today. They denigrated him as a scientist. They said he was not a true scientist, that he was a tinkerer. He just sort of, invented bifocals, built the Franklin stove, and did some other things, but he was not a true scientist. The fact is that Franklin was, without question, the most advanced physical scientist of the 18th century. There is really no one who lived, during his lifetime, which was a very long lifetime, who even comes close to his approach to science. What distinguished him was that, unlike a lot of people today who just sort of go into a laboratory and they try this or they try that, and what works, what doesn't work, it's sort of, pragmatic approach to scientific research, Franklin was always focused on, always insisted that the only thing that was worthwhile was to investigate the nature of things. Why does a natural phenomenon behave as it does? What are the underlying principles which govern the actions of the biosphere and the universe? In 1743, Franklin issued a proposal to create the American Philosophical Society. And in that, he wrote, quote, "All philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things tend to increase the power of man over matter." Now, that actually sort of encapsulates that one sentence, both Franklin's approach to science as well as his approach to economics, which is that you are seeking to understand certain previously unknown or hidden principles of the universe, principles of nature. And by unlocking these, you are vastly expanding mankind's power over nature, mankind's productive power. And in everything that he does, Franklin is asking himself the questions: will this benefit mankind? Will it contribute to further human progress, to advancing human civilization? And if you look at Franklin's investigations into magnetism, botany, minerals, the Gulf Stream, heat, light, and many other physical processes, he always is seeking to unlock the principles, the secrets governing those processes, and always with the intention of increasing the productive power of mankind over nature. In fact, after his work on electricity and his experiments, one of the things in a couple of letters he wrote that he's sort of lamented is, he said, despite all of these discoveries, these new revelations as to the nature of electricity and things of this sort, he said, despite all this, we have yet to discover practical applications for what we have discovered. And that was true at that time. Franklin's discoveries were profound, but the technology did not exist to put them into practice in any way that really, could be applied to manufacturing or agriculture or anything else. Now, this question of examining, the man's role with nature and examining the principles that govern nature, this really goes back far in the colonies. Before Franklin. One of the individuals who had the greatest influence on Franklin, on his philosophical and scientific outlook, was Cotton Mather. And Mather, in 1721, had written a book called The Christian Philosopher, Collection of the Best Discoveries in Nature, in which he had spent months and months and months investigating all kinds of things. I think a lot of it was botany, but there were other things he was investigating. And this work was the first scientific work published in the colonies by Cotton Mather. And and Mather is explicit, basically saying what I've already said. Mather is explicit where he says that unraveling the mysteries of the physical universe, that by doing this, new powers would be made available to humanity. And then later on, the person who had a very profound influence on Franklin, when Franklin was still a very, very young man, was a man named James Logan in Philadelphia. Some of you know of him. He's not very well known today, but in the generation immediately preceding Franklin, Logan was the premier scientist in the United States. And he did, he didn't really do a lot of, he did some experiments, but he did a lot of other things. He also built iron mills and what have you, canals, and this sort of thing. But in 1737, Logan published a book entitled "Of the Duties of Man as They May Be Deduced from Nature." And Logan wrote in that book, quote, "The creative power of the mind transcends the senses." The creative power of the mind transcends the senses. And Logan became, of his own intention, he became the leading opponent of Isaac Newton, as well as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, in the American colonies. In the work that I just mentioned, he excoriates, rips apart Newton and Locke and Hobbes. What he says explicitly is that true human knowledge is not based on sense perception, and he and more so, moreover, what he posits is the same thing that Cotton Mather had said some years earlier, which is that creative human reason was not based on sense perception, that there was a power of creativity in the mind, which was completely separate from the Newtonian mechanistic approach to science. Now, it was with Logan that Franklin basically, the young Franklin was a sort of a protege of Logan's. And it was with Logan that Franklin first became involved in, in the question of electricity. I'm not certain. I just don't know to what extent Logan carried out experiments in electricity. It's just something I don't know. But he certainly was examining the phenomenon of electricity, and he was writing about it. And in fact, in his work, The Creative Power of the Mind Transcends, or in his work of The Duties of Man as They May Be Deduced from Nature, Logan wrote, quote, "Electricity was formerly regarded but as a trifling appearance in nature, and therefore, in the last curious age, was very little considered. But now, more lately, we see surprising phenomena arising from electricity. We see a field opened up for speculations that, if duly pursued, may probably lead us into more just and extensive notions of our bodies and the world we live in than have hitherto been generally thought of." So that was Logan. And it was out of his collaboration with Logan that Franklin's interest in electricity began. Now, Franklin's own experiments in electricity began in 1746 as major experiments. He might have done something on a smaller scale that I'm not aware of, but his major experiments in electricity began in 1746, and they lasted for about 3 to 3.5 years till towards the end of 1749, including his kite experiment, which I'll discuss a little bit in a little later. And these Franklin's experiments were absolutely revolutionary in terms of the discoveries that he made. And in the course of doing it, he overthrew entirely the Newtonian notion of science. I mean, first off, one of the things he insisted on was that you do not make mere speculations about these things, but that every conclusion you reached had to be based on verifiable experimental results. The second thing he did is he denied Newton's notion of force, of a deus ex machina, and he insisted that nature, rather than needing some push from God or some materialistic, force to move things, to get things done, but that nature itself was governed. Universal actions were governed by inherent universal principles. And he is very explicit on this, Franklin. Now, in 1746, a friend of his in London sent him some jars and some other equipment through which he could carry out his experiments, including building his own, what was called a Leyden jar. Now, the Leyden jar was brand new. It had only been invented about a year earlier in the Netherlands. And Franklin got all this material and he began to go to work. Now, for those not familiar with it, a Leyden, I'm going to have to sort of read this from my notes. A Leyden jar is a glass jar. It contains liquid. And on the outside, there is a metal jacket covering the glass and a wire dangling into it from the top. Now, by rubbing the jar, you create a static, with a cloth or something. By rubbing the jar, you create a static electrical charge on the inside. And then to restore the equilibrium, all you have to do is hold the jar and touch the wire, at which point you're creating a circuit and you get a shock, And in fact, Franklin, in his experiments, as he made more and more powerful electrical devices, twice the shock he gave to himself knocked him on the floor unconscious. Now this was all known, that the Leyden jar could do this. By rubbing it, you create the static charge, and by closing the circuit, you create a shock. This had already been done in Europe, but no one knew why. No one could explain. No one, in Germany, in Holland, in England, in France, no one could explain why this occurred. So this is what Franklin began to investigate. Not, doing this produces a shock, but why does it produce a shock? And over the span of 3.5 years, Franklin conducted literally hundreds and hundreds of experiments. And he constructed scores, maybe hundreds, but dozens and dozens of new devices of his own invention to carry his experiments out. One of his first conclusions was that electricity was a type of energy which permeates the entirety of nature. And he called this electrical fire. Also, in Europe, they had said that there were two different kinds of electricity. I think one of them was called vitreous, and I think there was a name for the other one. I can't remember it. But they had said there were two different kinds of electricity. And Franklin disproved this and said that this was simply not true. There was one phenomenon which differed only in its internal makeup. And he gave names to this. He called it a positive charge and a negative charge within within this, and he said the interaction of the two charges produced a reaction which reorganized the electrical state of the host. And essentially what he's talking about here, even though he doesn't use these terms, what he's talking about is ionization. And he's really exploring what you could call today electron theory, even though, this was totally unknown at his time. He was the first one to discover the negative and positive charges. But this is absolutely frontier scientific work. He also hypothesized that electricity does not vanish, but it's always present in the same amount, the conservation of energy. In Europe, using mechanistic Newtonian methods, people investigating electricity there, it said that electricity moves. It moves from point A to point B, as a current. And Franklin disproved this. He proved that electricity does not move at all, that electricity is always present everywhere. Only the electrical charge is changed, and that human intervention could replicate and manipulate this process. In fact, he proved that in the Leyden jar, that the shock did not reside, that the electrical charge did not reside in the water at all, but in the glass, and that the Leyden effect was just a reorganization of the jar's internal electrical configuration. And he wrote, quote, "There is really no more electrical fire in the file after which what is called its charging, because the file will not suffer what is called charging unless as much fire can go out of it in one way as is thrown in by another. So wonderfully are these two states of electricity, the plus and the minus combined and balanced in this miraculous bottle." He also demonstrated, and this gets into the kite experiment, that electricity could be transmitted through the air. He postulated, in his own words, that electricity was composed of, quote, "extremely subtle particles which are suffused throughout nature and can penetrate even into the densest of matter." And this led him directly into his kite experiment. So in 17, and this actually, the kite experiment comes a little bit later, after a lot of his laboratory experiments. His experiments in his laboratory, or his study, whatever you want to call it, lasted about 3.5 years. But then a couple of years later, while he's still working on this, he conducts the kite experiment in 1752. And what he built was a special type of kite. The kite itself was made of silk. The wooden frame was made of cedar, and then the string coming down was hemp twine, running from the kite to the ground. At the bottom of the string, he attached a large metal key to absorb the electrical charge that ran down from the string. They flew this kite, I guess in a thunderstorm or something like a thunderstorm. It soared upwards and what have you. And they kept their eye on the twine and on the key. And later, the British scientist Joseph Priestley described what happened based on a conversation he had had with Franklin. And what Priestley says is, quote, Franklin observed loose threads of the hemp begin to stand erect and then to avoid one another, just as if they had been suspended on a common conductor. Struck with this promising appearance, he immediately presented his knuckle to the key. That is, he touched the metal key with his knuckle, and felt a shock. The discovery was complete. He perceived a very evident electric spark. When the rain had wet the string, he collected electric fire copiously. Now, the interesting thing here, because people think, well, people have the idea that lightning struck the kite. Lightning did not strike the kite, right? The really phenomenal thing here is that what the kite was doing, it's sailing up into thunder clouds and electrical storms and what have you, in which the air itself is being ionized, the atmosphere is being ionized. And what the kite did was collect the electrical charge from the ionized clouds, the gaseous clouds, and the which really, I'm not a scientist, but it's the ionized atmosphere from which the electrical charge is being drawn down. Later what he did is he repeated the experiment and hooked up the kite to a Leyden jar, one of these jars, and through the twine and what have you. And he drew electricity down from the atmosphere directly into the Leyden jar and charged the Leyden jar, which is that he drew lightning from the clouds, from the heavens. What I want to do now, and I realize that what I've gone through is a very, very, in some ways superficial, maybe not superficial, but, very quick synopsis of some of the work Franklin did. He actually wrote a book on his electrical experiments, which is available. But I want to move on to the concluding section of what I want to go through tonight. What I will tell you, I'll do a little plug for myself here, but people might be interested. For those who want to know more about this and really in general what I'm talking about tonight, I wrote a book called Hidden in Plain Sight. And in that book, there is an entire section devoted to what are called vignettes on Benjamin Franklin. And there's 10 of them. And this is available on Amazon. But, those vignettes go far more in depth than what I'm going through right now. But look, what I want to really discuss is, I said the second part of this was going to be on morality, Franklin's morality and philosophical outlook, because you can't look at any of this just in terms of science. As Tony mentioned, as Dan went through, yes, Prometheus gave mankind fire, but what he also gave mankind was human reason, the ability to create, and to uncover the secrets of the universe, as Franklin was, determined to do in his own time. So the fact is, I want to look at some of what was motivating Franklin, because as some people know, I'm not going to discuss it tonight, but as some people know, in 1727, when he was still very young, Franklin created a group called the Junto, comprised of 12 individuals. And this was a group which they said was for mutual improvement. And later, Franklin told Cotton Mather's, I think, son or nephew, that the motivation for him creating the Junto had been Cotton Mather's work, an essay upon the good, which was he wanted to create a society based on the idea of the common good and on the fact that the purpose of one's life should be to do good. That should be the purpose of one's life, to do good. That was Cotton Mather's argument, and that is what Franklin adopted in creating the Junto. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Junto, but less than 1 year after creating it, Franklin wrote an essay titled Articles of Belief and Acts of Religion. It's a very passionate and very moving personal essay. And I'll just read you two short paragraphs from it. He begins the work by declaring, this is 1728, I hold, if there is a power above us, and that there is, all nature cries aloud through all her works, he must delight in virtue, and that which he delights in must be happy. And then Franklin addresses the deity directly, and he says, quote, by thy wisdom hast thou formed all things. Thou hast created man, bestowing life and reason, and placed man in dignity superior to thy other earthly creatures. Now, think about the Prometheus myth we've been discussing. I'll read that again. This is Franklin addressing the deity in 1728. By thy wisdom hast thou formed all things. Thou hast created man, bestowing life and reason, and placed him in dignity superior to thy other earthly creatures. And 4 years later, Franklin wrote another work in 1732 entitled On the Providence of God in the Government of the World. And in that work, he says, we should love and revere that deity for his goodness and thank him for his benefits. We should adore him for his wisdom, fear him for his power, and pray to him for his favor and protection. And this religion will be a powerful regulator of our actions, give us peace and tranquility within our own minds, and render us benevolent, useful, and beneficial to others. And this is, I hope people are getting something out of this and following this chain of thought here. I'm going to move on to something else Franklin wrote about that same time in 1731, while engaged in his project to create the library company, which was going to be the first public library in America, in the colonies, making books available to the public. Franklin wrote a short work entitled Observations on My Reading History in a Library. And he writes that fewer still in public affairs act with a view to the good of mankind there seems to me at present to be great occasion for raising a united party for virtue, by forming the virtuous and good men of all nations into a regular body, to be governed by suitable, good, and wise rules, which good and wise men may probably be more unanimous in their obedience to than common people are to common laws. I at present think that whoever attempts this aright and is well qualified cannot fail of pleasing God and of meeting with success. And then in 1743, he authored a proposal for the creation of the American Philosophical Society, which he titled A Proposal for Promoting Useful Knowledge Among the British Plantations in America. And, you know, this question of being a useful citizen, Franklin wrote about this over and over and over again. But it's a notion of contributing to the future, contributing to a better society, developing one's skills, whether they're mechanical skills or scientific skills or others, developing one's skills to the utmost in order to be able to contribute to the development of a better society. And in 1749, he authored two works on education. One of them was entitled Proposals Relating to the Education of Youth in Pennsylvania. And in that he says, the history of commerce, of the invention of arts, the rise of manufacturers, the progress of trade, the change of its seats with the reasons, causes, etc., may also be made entertaining to youth and will be useful to all. And this will naturally introduce a desire to be instructed in mechanics and to be informed of the principles of that art by which weak men perform such wonders. This will be the time to show them prints of ancient and modern machines, to explain them, to let them be copied, and to give lectures in mechanical philosophy. The idea of what is true merit should also be often presented to youth, explained and impressed on their minds as consisting in an inclination joined with an ability to serve mankind, to serve one's country, friends, and family, which ability is, with the blessing of God, to be acquired or greatly increased by true learning, and should indeed be the great aim and end of all learning. So, I'll give you just one other thing to give you a sense of Franklin's, Franklin in science. This is not something he directly participated in, but it is something which he supported, championed, funded. He actually gave a lot of money to do this, which was that in the 1780s, in a number of countries, but particularly in France, in and around Paris, people began to experiment with human flight. Particularly two different kinds of balloons: hot air balloons, and then balloons filled with hydrogen. In 1783, the first experiments in human flight took place in Paris, where the Montgolfier brothers, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, Well, they launched into flight. They launched a unmanned flight in Lyons, and then in September, it's kind of funny. They sort of did what the Russians did and what the United States did at the beginning of the space program. They launched 3 hot air balloons, the Montgolfier brothers. First was an unmanned balloon, see if it would float. Then they sent up a balloon which included a rooster, a duck, and a sheep. Kind of like we sent up chimpanzees and dogs. And when they were able to recover these animals alive, then they sent up a flight in Paris in September with 2 human beings. Now, Franklin provided a big chunk of the money for them to do this. He was the ambassador to France at that time. He was in Paris. And when the people who went up in the balloon came down, the very first thing they did was to go to Franklin's residence to meet with him and report to him on everything that had happened, the problems they had, and to report on the flight. Franklin also gave money to people who were experimenting with hydrogen balloons. And shortly after only about a month after the first successful manned hot air balloons went up, the first manned hydrogen balloon went up. This was the Robert brothers, and this was also launched in Paris. And that balloon transcended to 3,000 meters above the sky, and traveled 27 miles, which is pretty darn good. Traveled 27 miles. It was a manned balloon flight. And these were the first. I mean, you think of astronauts or cosmonauts. I mean, you could call these first manned balloon flights, the people in them, aeronauts. I mean, they were doing something which had never been done before in human history. And it involved an understanding of the atmosphere, of heat, of air pressure, of wind currents. They weren't just, flaky little, experiments or something. These were well researched, well thought out scientific experiments. In fact, Franklin called the balloon flights, his term for it was aerostatic experiments. So there's a lot more I could go through. In fact, I have a whole page here I didn't discuss, but it's 5 to 5. Just sort of in wrapping it up, I mean, this question, going back to Cotton Mather through Logan, but then what we see with Franklin, the genius and courage of Franklin, the explosion of this, is of the human creative impulse to investigate and to master, to understand, principles which govern the natural universe, and to bring those principles then under the mastery of mankind, to make them do work for the betterment and the development of mankind. This is what Franklin devoted his life to. This is what Franklin's life was all about. I mean, it's really astounding. So I ran through all that pretty quick, but I hope people got something out of it. So let's just stop here and open it up for discussion.
Yes, that was inspiring. Thank you so much.